Australia's government has acknowledged that the Bondi Beach massacre, which killed 15 and injured dozens at a Hanukkah celebration, was likely motivated by ISIS ideology. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the father-son attackers, Zahid and Naveed Akram, appeared driven by Islamic State teachings. Police confirmed ISIS flags and improvised explosive devices were found in their vehicle. Naveed had been investigated in 2019 for ISIS associations but was not deemed a threat. Officials now suspect further radicalization, possibly during a recent trip to the Philippines where they may have received military-style training. Critics accuse the government of focusing on gun control instead of extremist ideology, noting Saeed legally owns 6 firearms despite his son's ties to radicals. Resident doctors in England will launch a 5-day strike from Wednesday after 83% of British Medical Association members rejected the government's latest offer, which included expanded specialist training posts and reimbursement of exam fees but no additional pay. Health Secretary Wes Streeting condemned the walkout as self-indulgent, irresponsible, and dangerous, arguing it threatens patient safety amid record flu hospitalizations and what some call a superflu. He urged doctors to postpone the strike until January, but the union insisted the proposal was too little, too late. Hospital leaders warned the action will cause serious disruption as the NHS faces rising flu cases, staffing strain, and low public support for the strike. The U.S. State Department will designate Colombia's Clan del Golfo as both a foreign terrorist organization and a specially designated global terrorist entity, imposing sanctions and criminal penalties. Officials say the cartel, responsible for cocaine trafficking, human trafficking, assassinations, and terror attacks, poses a major national security threat. The group, with an estimated 10,000 members, grew under leaders Giovanni and Otoniel, the latter extradited to the U.S. and sentenced to 45 years. President Trump previously issued an executive order enabling terrorist designations for cartels. The sanctions block assets, bar entry into the U.S., and prohibit material support. The move follows rising global cocaine production and Colombia's faltering total peace negotiations under President Gustavo Petro. President Trump filed a lawsuit seeking at least $10 billion from the BBC, alleging defamation and deceptive practices over a Panorama documentary that edited his January 6, 2021 speech in a way that appeared to urge violence at the Capitol. The BBC apologized for creating a mistaken impression, but denied defamation, noting the edit prompted internal criticism and the resignations of Director General Tim Davie and new CEO Deborah Turnus. President Trump contends the broadcaster put words in his mouth, possibly using AI, and intentionally manipulated the footage to influence the 2024 election. The lawsuit seeks at least $5 billion in damages per count. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage accused the Labour government of enabling state-sponsored child abuse by permitting clinical trials of puberty blockers on minors. Although the NHS ended routine prescribing of puberty blockers after the Cash review, it allowed limited trials, leading King's College to launch a study of 250 children aged 10 to 15 who will receive the drugs for 2 years. Farage urged Prime Minister Keir Starmer to halt the trial, arguing it violates the NHS duty to protect children. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage spoke about the anti-Semitic attack at Bondi Beach.
Harbour Bridge the next day. No, I think actually in Australia, of all the Western countries, we've seen fire bombings, we've seen threats, we see graffiti, we see a Jewish community in Sydney virtually under siege. So if there was any country in which it was going to happen, I'm sorry to say that Australia was top of the list.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today.
There is a problem with medicine, and we can explain what it is by looking back to the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin, it turns out, was not just an accidental finding. Alexander Fleming discovered that mold he found in a culture dish was killing bacteria, but it took over 10 years before a team at Oxford University were able to isolate the active ingredient. They produced small quantities for preclinical and clinical trials, helping prove the compound was safe and could beat infection. However, they couldn't produce it at scale. In 1941, Andrew Jackson Moyer of the US Department of Agriculture, the forerunner to the FDA, suggested changes to the manufacturing process, enabling mass production. It turns out medicines are not invented when someone discovers a new molecular entity. They are the product of key stakeholders working together collaboratively. until medicine can be manufactured at scale, it may as well not exist. And in 2025, this is a problem. In the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies began outsourcing production. Suddenly the system was significantly less integrated. Someone with a new discovery today will find themselves disconnected from the rest of the development and manufacturing process. Companies that develop medicine are still happy to work with big established pharma companies, but the modern day Flemings are cut out of the system. The result is far fewer new medicines coming to market. We want to fix this by ensuring the pharma industry builds a more integrated supply chain. We also believe that doctors' expertise administering medicine should be included at the beginning of the process. We know that doctors on the front line have insights about how to repurpose medicine. Doctors should be able to report their findings so that the necessary testing can be completed and they can share their results worldwide. Learn more here and help us take medicines back to the future.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome back to the Protagonists here at the World Today. Nice to have your company. Are we going to go to war? Let's discuss that very shortly. The UK and Europe, at least its leaders, are desperate for a war after failing to address their budgetary problems, uncontrolled immigration, spiralling energy and food cost, and failing infrastructure. These countries are calling their citizens to protect a foreign, corrupt, undemocratic state and face war with Russia. What could possibly go wrong? Which continues to assert it has no interest in a war against the West. UK Chief of Defence Staff Richard Knighton advises that Russia wants to divide and destroy NATO. What's wrong with that? Which is why it's necessary to prepare for a brutal war. He says the war in Ukraine and Russia's previous records show that Putin's willingness to strike neighbouring states, including their children and civilian populations. The Russian leadership has made it clear that it intends to challenge NATO, constrain it, divide it, and ultimately destroy the alliance. A new era in defence means not just that the armed forces and government structures need to act more actively. It means that our entire nation needs to step up. And to do that, we need to contribute to this national dialogue and bring these issues to the forefront, as our allies have done in many countries right across Europe. It becomes a problem for the West if Russia begins to take these leaders seriously, which it must do, because nobody else will. The elephant in the room is the US, and it's a big elephant, and a big, beautiful elephant. The message of the recently released National Security Strategy provides a strong clue. Germany has recently acknowledged the end of Pax Americana and the need to ramp up its own military spending. However, the Europeans need more than financial resources to fight a world war. They need citizens that have a stomach for this conscription or not. Let's talk to our panel about what they think. Is there going to be a war? Are we ready for a war? The views on likely developments in Europe's phony war and how they think this will end. Our panel is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, analyst and author, Pelle Taylor, journalist and filmmaker of the best possible kind, and Alex Kriel, founder of Thinking Coalition. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Marcus, give us your views on where the land lies at the moment.
Well, Mike, on the face of it, one is tempted to think that the Western ruling elites are looking to instigate war with the Russian Federation, but in reality, they are not. The reason why they are claiming, without any evidence whatsoever, that Russia is looking to provoke war with the Western world is for numerous reasons. One being that the Western world, as a result of the dangerous concept and practice of multiculturalism and immigration, is in a terrible state of affairs. Secondly, the economic situation of the Western world is absolutely diabolical. Therefore, the Western ruling elites are hoping to try and distract their respective populations' attention away from the carnage of what is occurring in countries such as Britain, Canada, America, Britain, and France. Regarding the recent claim by the British Chief of Defence that Russia is looking to provoke war, and therefore British families need to prepare their sons and daughters for war, he also said in that speech something else, something that British mainstream media did not cover. He said that his experts have come to the conclusion that the chances of a war between Russia and the West is at, quote, 5%. So if it's at 5%, why on earth would he make the claim that British families need to prepare their children to go and fight against the Russian army? On top of that, I think we also need to be very aware that in Britain, for certain, the British state is in the process of decimating what remains of free speech and civil liberties, all in the run up to 2030. So, by the British state saying to the British people that Russia poses a threat to British national security, the British state is saying to the British people the following: we want to protect you. We need to protect you against Russia. But in order to do so, we need to give ourselves more power. So those are the reasons as to why the British ruling elites, the Western ruling elites as a whole, is making this unsubstantiated claim against Russia. There will be no war between NATO and Russia. Why? Because a conventional war between NATO and Russia would rapidly escalate into a nuclear war between the two. And a nuclear war would mean the end of life as we know it, not just in Russia, not just in the Western world, but in the world as a whole.
Pelle Taylor, a friend of ours, and actually of everybody, a friend of ours is Mats Nielsen, and he always suggested that no, we won't go to war. It's not going to happen because of the one thing which Marcus has alluded to. It will destroy the end of the planet, but it would also hurt business. He always says it will hurt business. As a guy that goes between Europe and the UK, you see both sides. You see what's happening in Europe and you see what's happening in the UK. What's your thoughts? Are we going to go to war, or is it just beating each other's chest?
I hope not. I mean, I think the MI6's new chief, Blaise Metravelli, made a speech yesterday, and so did the chief of the staff. And the Germans, I've been following the German debate on Twitter and the French debate, actually, and everyone is kind of laughing at this. So, and I also read the comments on the Daily Telegraph, which is the right-wing conservative newspaper. And although they're very anti-Russian, they're also very anti-war. And I can't believe that all the comments from at the bottom of the page are from bots, because they're written in very idiomatic English. They could be potentially be Russian, but I don't think so. I think there's a very widespread. I mean, they see that the war leaders are completely out of tune. They're not reading the room, and at the moment, I mean, what I'm thinking is, think back to the Iraq. War, which required 18 months of steady propaganda and occasioned the biggest demonstrations in Britain's history and endless. I mean, it sucked out all the oxygen out of the British political room for 18 months. And that was only a war on what is, after all, a relatively small country that's not determinative for world peace or world war. So a war that would plunge Britain into an existential crisis is, I don't know, we're far off from that, I hope. But I do think that it's worth thinking up the scenarios. I think that what very few commentators, apart from Alex Kreiner and maybe one or two others, is talking about is the total breakdown in relations between the UK and the US. And I think, and everyone is keeping quiet about it on the British and American side because these are the old allies and they prefer to have their quarrels like a close marriage behind closed doors. But I think that what's very interesting is that Trump went to the state visit in September in the UK and saw himself being buttered up by the king, no less, and all that, the whole sort of BJ treatment that the British establishment can do, second state visit, and all that. And King Charles pointedly alluding to, we're standing together in this great endeavor, channeling Winston Churchill about conflict with Russia. He did the same damn thing a couple of weeks later, having failed with the Americans to try and get the Germans on board, almost the same words. We stand together in this great endeavor against the Russians, sort of thing, fighting tyranny and all that. Anyway, I don't think Trump was impressed. I think that, but what he did was offer was the Brits a way out of their conflict with Russia, which is, the Brits are leading this. Make no mistake about it. It's sort of like Suez all over again. The early 1950s when Britain thought it was an independent great power, and basically going against the Americans in quite a strong way. And so Trump offered a sort of $30 billion worth of tech investment, AI and all that. He had with him captains of industry sitting there at the state banquet saying, basically to the Brits, as he does to all his adversaries, let's make business, not war, sort of thing. He's a real estate developer. So he's saying, Britain, don't go to war with Russia. Don't think about these things. Here, we're going to invest in you. And the British press leapt on this and they said, yes, our Brexit has worked out for us because, we can get the fast business practices of the American Silicon Valley to invest in us. We're going to be Singapore on Thames and all the rest of it. Well, now Trump has halted that as of yesterday. So basically, he's punishing the Brits for putting Ukraine ahead of their relationship with the United States. Now, everyone knows that the Brits have been a Robin to Britain's Batman in world politics, America's Batman for 50 or 60 years. And to prioritize this bankrupt narco state, Ukraine, over its relationships with America means that Ukraine is very, very, very important to the British. And I think partly MI6 don't want their various hoaxes to unravel. We've done the Skripal hoax. And I think that if this story comes out, if the last 10 years of MI6 type provocations and all the coups, and then the Ukrainians might turn on them, I think the British diplomatic position might be so fragile that they're prepared to risk the relationship with the United States and prioritize Ukraine over that. So on the other hand, I don't see a war in the short term. I think that the depth of Britain's commitment to Ukraine is so strong that they're willing to basically flip the birdie to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is responding in his new national security strategy, basically singling out the Brits and the Europeans as a number one adversary. So I think the Brits are probably mobilizing their assets in the United States, hoping to get their Democrat friends to win the midterms and maybe impeach Trump. So there's a kind of war going on between the Brits and the Americans, and we'll see how that plays out. That's what that's what I'd look at and focus on, and also the possibility of a false flag, that is, the Brits' allies in the Scandinavian, the Baltic states, would stop a Russian tanker or Russian so-called shadow fleet, and then board it and get the Russians to react, and then create a sort of world-type diplomatic crisis and get the Americans dragged in that way. If we have a chance, we can get granular, and I could talk about World War I, because the Brits did exactly the same things to the Americans, dragged them in and provoked the Germans back in World War I. Anyway, that's all I have to say for the moment.
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it, Alex? I'm just wondering, do you have your galoshes ready to head to the front line? And will you be carrying a 303 or a water pistol? Because I don't see the Brits being all that well armed. But they are pushing, the rhetoric for war is there. if a country talks about war, it's a magnificent way of stopping the conversations between those within that particular the border. And if you have unrest and all that sort of stuff, if they stop if they put limitations on what you can say because we're going to war, we don't want the enemy to hear or whatever, it does open up a can of worms for them. Because this is not about war. I don't think it's about war because no one's going to win this. And at the moment, the UK would have trouble against anybody. Even Tahiti could attack it because it's not that well supplied with arms at the moment. But collectively, you have the EU and the UK. They could put a fairly good army together, but they're not going to do a whole lot of damage to Putin, who's a seasoned, as some would say, warmonger, which is not. So what do you think? Off to war, galoshes and all, Dad's army, or do you think this is just all rhetoric and a lot of BS?
Yeah, I agree with the other speakers. The problem we have, I mean, Britain is not ready for this war, and the comments, as Pelle said in the Telegraph, were 100% negative when they came out with this warmongering from the head of MI6. They were all absolutely panning these talking heads, saying, you know, deal with Britain's problems, deal with the British border. Why are we going 1,500 miles east to deal with somebody else's border? And the mood that I saw was totally negative. The problem is you have this group of Euro-Atlanticists, which is sort of Boris Johnson, Hillary Clinton, Lord Hague, who are absolute ideologues, who have decided that it's an issue of principle for them, that Ukraine should be in NATO, and therefore they'll drag us into war just because they want to get their own way, essentially. And they're not, I don't think, really interested even in the public support for that or in the financial realities of the UK budget or anything else, basically. They're ideologues and therefore they're dangerous. And I agree with Pelle that Trump has basically said, you know, you guys get at it if you want to do this. We see you probably more as the enemy than we do in Russia. He was quite clear that Europe is heading in the wrong direction under this kind of globo leftist regime, and that's an interesting fight that's going to play out. So unfortunately, there are ideologues that will push for war, irrespective of the lack of support from the people or irrespective of the military or financial realities.
Marcus, I'm just thinking, if there is a war, if not war, but if there is an inclination of a war, how does the EU and the UK encourage the US to be part of that? Because Trump, as Alex just mentioned, is not terribly keen on any of that, and you guys go for it. But if there is a war, you could quite possibly have, even though Mats Nielsen thinks otherwise, you could still possibly have a nuclear stoush, which is the end for everybody. But they would probably need the US to step it up and become part of the coalition of the stupid. How would they do that? How do you think? What would be one way of telling Donald to come back to the fold and let's go and beat that evil bear?
Let me first of all say, Mike, the Daily Telegraph is pro-war and vehemently so. Its columnists are pro-war. Its editorial is pro-war. When it runs news articles regarding the so-called Russian threat, it doesn't put Russian threat in quotation marks. Not so long ago, one of the columnists of the Daily Telegraph said this, that British nuclear warheads should be attached to British tanks being operated by the Ukrainian army in Ukraine, and therefore that would stop the Russians from attacking Ukraine. So the Daily Telegraph, like all other British mainstream media outlets, is cancerous, is pro-war, and is an enemy of the British people. It routinely labels British patriots as, quote, far right. So let us be very aware of that. In regards to Britain and the European Union, we need to see the bigger picture. Donald Trump is not fully in control of America. There is a power struggle going on at the moment in America between Trump and the American deep state. And the American deep state is aided by the British deep state in particular, and also by the deep states in Europe, for example, in France and in Germany. So the deep states are attempting to derail Trump's attempts to bring about a peaceful end to the war in Ukraine. They know that without America, there can be no war between NATO and Russia. Why? Because America is NATO. NATO is America. So we need to see the bigger picture. As I said moments ago, it is simply inconceivable that there will be a war between NATO and Russia. There could, of course, be an accidental war. So the British ruling elite, without intending to bring about a war, could do something close to the Russian border, which the Russians either misunderstand or misinterpret, and then you have a war on your hands. But other than that, there is very little chance of a war breaking out. But certainly the American deep state and the British deep state are trying to outmaneuver the Russians. How are they doing that? They have instructed their puppet in Kiev, Zelensky, to say this, that Ukraine is prepared to shelve the idea of NATO membership in return for Western security guarantees. Now, Western security guarantees to Ukraine would constitute de facto Ukrainian membership of NATO. Russia will never tolerate NATO personnel or NATO hardware in Ukraine. So that is why, even if officially Ukraine gives up its aspirations of joining NATO, the Russians will never accept Western security guarantees. Furthermore, even if NATO was to put into writing that Ukraine will never be invited to join the Western military bloc, the Kremlin will not believe a word that is written on paper by the West. Why? Because the Americans walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. And in 2019, the Americans walked away from the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, both of which have had horrific ramifications for the security of the world, because it has played a major role in bringing about a terrible level of tension between America and Russia. So in short, even if the West was to put into writing that Ukraine will not be invited to join NATO, the Kremlin will not trust a word that the West says. That is why I have said since the very start of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, that now that the Russian military is in Ukraine, the Russians will not stop. Russian national security is at risk, and that is why the Russian military will either capture all or most of Ukraine. This is the only opportunity the Russians have now to ensure that Ukraine will never become a part of NATO, either officially or de facto.
Pelle, just the because we need to look at history here, and a couple of great, because Christmas is just around the corner. The War Guilt Question and Hands Off Our War, available at Amazon. There you are. But we can learn a lot from history, can't we? What does history tell us about this posturing at the moment?
Well, I wrote 2 books about diplomacy. One about diplomacy before the war, World War One, which has been well covered, and then diplomacy during World War One, which is far less well covered. And I started this project somewhat quixotically during the COVID crisis. I thought, but it's actually turned out to be a very timely book. I mean, I'm amazed. I mean, there are other good World War One historians out there, and they haven't appeared in the news made any attempt. And when I had TNT, my TNT show, I had a few of them on, and I tried to get them to talk about it. But I don't know, some of them had positions in academia, and they didn't want to talk about it because it struck me that the way that Germany was isolated, by the British establishment, is very similar to the way Russia's been isolated in the last couple of years. And there's a cabal basically in Britain. I mean, Britain.
We actually have Pelle who's just frozen. So we'll come back in a second. Here he is. Pelle, continue on. You froze.
Yeah, sorry. So basically, I think that we talk about the Nazis, and everyone knows histories of Goebbels and Goering and his love affairs and his laundry lists and all the rest of it. But we should know about this British public school cabal who start war after war after war. Maybe they're not as guilty as the Nazis, but certainly World War One. You had people educated at Harrow, Winchester, Eton, and Westminster, news editors and diplomats, people working in Whitehall, and the Foreign Secretary, all totally committed to hostility with Germany. They were convinced that the Germans were the devil, and they weren't. They were the civilized, nearly democracy, which actually had full franchise in the Reichstag, which more than the British had in the Parliament. A brilliant artistic and scientific state, which was totally demonized by the British press, the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail. They're called the Huns, from 1905. You can't deal with the Huns, the Prussian pest, these animals. Just read it. It's all there in the archives. So they were from day one, the British decided you couldn't negotiate with the Germans because they were the Prussian pest. And the Americans tried to broker peace from the 6th of August 1914 all the way through. And in 1916, when the Germans were leading, they were far into Russia and far into France, although there was a stalemate along the trenches. There's a quite advanced peace process going on between the Germans and the Americans, who were then neutral. And Wilson, the president, said, I'm not going to send our boys into foreign war sort of thing. And he won the election of November 1916. And he sent his envoy, the sort of Steve Witkoff of his time, called Colonel House, an amateur basically, traveled around the capitals, went via Switzerland to Germany and vice versa, back to France and Britain. And they ran rings around him. They ran circles around him. And he was an amateur. And Wilson didn't have any staff. He was composing his own diplomatic telegrams on his little typewriter next to his bed or something. So amateurish. And that reminds me of the way that the Europeans are running rings around Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And that now got these guys to put the Americans into security guarantee to defend the Ukrainians, which is disastrous. It's guaranteed to be gamed by the Ukrainians and the British if that happens. In other words, they'll create a provocation and America will be drawn in. That's one possibility. And what happened was that the Americans had the ability to stop the war by stopping ammunition supplies and loans, because the British had run out of everything by the autumn of 1916. They had no money left in the bank. But somehow, and they were going to, it's all in the archives, it's not a conspiracy theory, they were going to run out of resources by May or March 1917. So the British knew that they had to drag in the Americans into the war by March 1917, or their supplies would run out. And Wilson had actually stopped sending money to the Americans. I can't remember the technical term, but he persuaded the Federal Reserve or something to stop issuing loans or guaranteeing loans issued by private banks. So he'd set in train the process by which the British would have to stop the war in a few months' time. The British knew this. So they knew that they had to get the hardliners in Germany to start up the submarine warfare, which they'd stopped for a year. And they managed to do that because all the telegrams between Germany and the United States went via British telegraph cables. So they stopped those telegrams from going. So the British and Americans, the Germans and the Americans couldn't communicate. And it's still, the whole story is still not told. I mean, there's something that happened in January 1917, which basically stopped the peace process. And no one can, you need to unravel that. You need to probably spend a year or two just on what happened in that month. But basically, Wilson's peace process, a peace without victory, a peace where everyone would be happy, which would have avoided Nazism, which would have avoided communism, which would have avoided the Russian Revolution, and everybody getting their independence back, and everyone saying no one won the war. There would have been no Versailles Treaty, no starvation in Germany. All that could have been achieved, and it wasn't, because the British wanted to fight on to the end, and they could only do that if they could bring the Americans in, and they successfully did that. And the parallels are that the whole British strategy is always bring in the Americans and then we're sorted. And I think they're still aiming for something like that. And if there'd been a much greater awareness of that, such as we have awareness of what the Nazis did, we'd be much better mentally equipped for what's going on right now.
Alex, obviously, and point out if I'm wrong here, obviously Europe hasn't got the funds to really have any sort of war unless they utilise the confiscated Russia's assets to capitalise on that and fund their war. If they were to use Russia's confiscated assets to wage war, what do you think the reply would be from Putin?
Well, I mean, they have an internal economy here. They don't need any sort of external support. So right now, they're already. I mean, I don't want to get these numbers wrong, but I think they're firing 28,000 artillery shells a day, which is roughly equal to a month of production from the West. So, you know, the Russians have an internal economy. They've got the natural resource to manufacture weapons, artillery shells, and everything else. And they've been successful in stepping up on drone warfare. So the Russians, you know, have fought. They will fight. The West has committed somewhere about 400 billion all in, including, I think, about 200 and something billion of that is military aid. And the Russians just keep fighting, and their recruitment rate is 15,000 a month faster than Ukraine. So they're going to keep fighting. There's so far everything that's been thrown at them, they keep advancing, albeit slowly. So that will be the response.
Marcus, because you study Russia and the history of Russia and stuff, if Europe does use the assets that they confiscated illegally to fund their war against the people they stole the assets from, what do you think Putin would do?
I think, Mike, the Kremlin will, of course, go on a PR campaign against Europe for doing so, or the European Union, I should say, for doing so. After all, the European Union is not Europe. But the Kremlin understands, as does the ordinary Russian, that there is a war in Ukraine. And this war has been brought about by NATO expansion. Therefore, the Russians will simply continue fighting. As I said moments ago, the Russians entered Ukraine after years of warning that unless their security needs are listened to and accepted by NATO or the Western ruling elites, then there is going to be a very serious situation which emerges in Ukraine. And thus we have war. So really, the momentum is with the Russians. They are advancing along the entire front line. The Russians are also in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. They are in the Sumy Oblast. They are in the Kharkov Oblast. People need to understand that the Russians will not simply stop in the Donbass or in Zaporozhye or in Kherson. No. Why? Because if the Russians were to stop in the Donbass and in Zaporozhye and Kherson and leave it at that, then Russian national security would still be in peril. Why? Because the Ukrainian cabal in Kiev would still be in power. The Ukrainian armed forces, which is controlled by NATO, would still be in existence. And of course, the Western ruling elite will never give up their objective of bringing Ukraine into NATO. So the Russians will advance. They will cross the Dnipro, as they did in the autumn of 1943. There is, let's just say the Russians were to stop in the Donbass and in the other two regions along the Black Sea. Well, NATO tactical aircraft operating from, let's say, Kiev or Sumy could reach Moscow in between 10 and 15 minutes. Ukraine would be bristling with NATO soldiers and NATO hardware. So whatever Trump attempts to do, and I congratulate him for that, it is not going to be met with a positive sign from the Russians, simply because the Russians, as I said, they know that Trump is not fully in control of America. And secondly, when Trump leaves the White House, well, what then? What will his successor be like? But also, as I also mentioned, the Russians do not trust anything that the West says or puts into writing. I've already mentioned the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty. Those two treaties, which came to an end because of the Americans, were absolutely critical turning points in relations between the West and Russia. So the Russians have the momentum. This is their opportunity. As Putin said at the start of what he calls the special military operation, it will take however long it takes. The Russians will fight for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it takes to bring back the lands which comprise Ukraine. I don't think the Russians will go as far as the westernmost part of Ukraine, which is historically known as Eastern Galicia, because there you find anti-Russian sentiment. So I believe the Russians will go as far as and will capture the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia. And I believe that's when the Russians will say Russian national security has been saved, and now we can preserve Russian national security.
Pelle, I just got to ask you, I think, because UK Chief of Defence Staff Richard Knighton says that Russia want to invade other territories, eat the children and stuff, and then destroy NATO and divide it, and all that sort of stuff, destroy the alliance. Just your thoughts on that, and do you think that perhaps a greater threat to NATO is Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think so. I think that what the British are doing, I mean, it's always keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down, you know. And I think that Lord Ismail said that in 1953 or something, and it's still true. I mean, the NATO is the great multiplier for British power, especially now that Brexit was achieved, and they've always used their networks in America, the British brain to American brawn. And the Americans always struggle to break free from that. You know, I mean, they're the superpower, for Christ's sake. But I think that it refers to what your question, but also to what Marcus said, because what's happening is that the British are saying Putin can't be trusted because he wants to invade. He wants to go further. I think Putin is genuinely happy. I mean, there were very far-reaching agreements in Istanbul in 2022 which would have allowed Ukraine to keep everything with security guarantees. I mean, this was a few days into the war, just like the Germans in 1914 were willing to make a peace deal with the British, which we never hear about. But what happens is that the British create this sense of insecurity in the Russians, and that they can't be. The Ukrainians are always going to want to go into NATO. So this lack of trust pushes Putin west, and suddenly, he's not to be trusted. You know, look. So I think that there's still a part of the British security state that thinks that they can turn Trump. You know, Trump's has got Putin's back at the moment, but they're perhaps hoping for this conversion at some point when Putin, out of insecurity or because he doesn't trust the British, maybe some provocation inside Russia, maybe some sinking of a Russian submarine with British help, and to create the self-fulfilling prophecy that he's not to be trusted. So maybe they're looking for that break point, you know, the sort of the March 1939 point. You know, Hitler invaded the Czech lands after the Munich crisis. It was thought to be satisfactorily resolved in the autumn of 1938. I don't want to defend Hitler in any way. I mean, that was when Hitler revealed himself. Okay, but I mean, they're looking for him. But that's when public opinion changed, and that's when people thought this man is a madman. He's not going to stop. Well, I think they're going to try and pin that on Putin. I don't think Putin is a Hitler, by the way, but once they've got that, it's off to the races. Then kind of rearmament can begin. So I think that the Russians are very aware of this because they know. I mean, the aim of diplomacy is like a chess game, like it's called Zugzwang, I think, in chess, where you get your opponent to play a bad move, whatever he does. So the Russians stay put and their security is not assured, or they move forward and their security is not assured either, because they bring the Americans in on the opposing side when public opinion says, well, we told you Putin couldn't be trusted because now he's taken Odessa. But if he doesn't take Odessa, then the pinprick attacks against the Black Sea Fleet will continue. So in a way, but at the moment, of course, though, I mean, Trump is basically kind of leaving NATO. I think that they've been trying to pull the troops out of the front line in Poland and Romania for the last 2 years or something. And he's basically said that NATO's going to man up by 2027 because the Americans are going to pull out. I think that Rubio didn't turn up for the NATO defense ministers or foreign ministers meeting the other day. And they've kind of put a lot of the burden onto the Germans, which is sort of a mistake. Because I'm in two minds. I don't know what the other guys feel about this, but if the responsible Americans leave NATO and somehow the Germans, under this lunatic Merz, get into the driving seat, they might do crazy things. So in some ways, leaving Europe to its own devices might be something you don't want to wish for. I don't know what you think, guys.
Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, certainly in our area, believe that the Western ruling class is a much bigger threat to the West than Vladimir Putin is in Russia. I think you other speakers have mentioned the state of the UK. If you look at these experiments they performed over the last 15 years with open borders and multiculturalism, promotion of kind of, let's say, niche interests, and it's been really a cultural revolution that these guys have tried to impose on the West. And we're seeing the results every day. It's not a happy place, not sort of economically and not culturally. So I'm hoping that people wake up and realize that their sort of own leadership is probably causing a lot more damage to Western countries, particularly UK, than Vladimir Putin is in Russia, and that's where they need to concentrate their energies, essentially. And that comes back to your point: is this a whole distraction? Are the elites pointing the finger at Putin and claiming this desire to invade Europe as a distraction from their own problems? And actually, NATO's early analysis of Russia actually showed that Russia had not been investing in any kind of offensive technologies, and their stance was defensive and deterrence. So NATO's own analysis shows, the Russians were not interested in invading Europe or really having much of an offensive capability. So that also completely undermines the political message that Russia wants to roll into Germany and France, which makes no sense whatsoever. So I don't believe any of that.
Can I just intervene? I think that the British intelligence ran far ahead of the British military. So, I mean, everyone says it's a joke, the British military, which it is. But there are a few ideologues inside the intelligence agencies who created a situation, created an enemy, basically, which created a reality because they, through a 20-year non-stop campaign of humiliation. We all remember the Skripal hoax coming out in 2018, just before the Russians were going to launch their coming out event, which was the World Cup, Sochi event, non-stop negativity. I mean, there's one thing that journalists use due diligence and criticism, but I mean, this relentless attack. And I think a lot of people underemphasize the cultural game in a way. The Russians have always had this complex about the West, Western Europe. And they feel that especially the liberal elite in Russia, they wanted to be accepted as players, as a serious power, European, but not NATO. And they've got a lot to give and all that. And they always talk about being accepted, but they're constantly treated as the guy from the countryside. You can't let them in through the door. And of course, you've got the sort of cultural superiority complex of the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Balts, who themselves feel slightly inferior towards Britain and France. And Britain and France have been playing this cultural superiority game for centuries, And if you do a little bit more, you too can become like a Frenchman or an Englishman. And I mean, the Swedes are not immune for that. They think that just because propaganda comes out of an English mouth with an English accent, then it's somehow more credible. And I said, stop it. I wish we had a German on today, because the Germans, West Germans, are just as prone to it. And we saw that before World War One as well, that they went fox riding and the Kaiser Wilhelm spoke fluent English, and they had the Kiel Regatta, which was a copy of the Cowes Regatta, and they invited English girls over to sit on the sun decks in the hope that, there would be more English somehow. And it didn't help. They were always seen as arrivistes and barbarians. And it's that cultural game. And the Ukrainians were the little brothers of the Russians. They're sort of elevated to think that they are the elves and the Russians are the orcs. And they've hitherto occupied quite an obscure part of East European history. So I think that game, and the Australians, of course, know that game as well. Anyway.
Marcus, what do you think?
I think we need to be aware that the likes of Starmer, Macron, and Merz are simply puppets. They are simply self-serving, useful idiots. They are not in control. The real powers at the heart of the Western world, which rule the Western world, are European monarchies, principally the British monarchy, European aristocracies, principally the British aristocracy, the banking elites, financial elites, media barons, and so on and so on. These are the ones who are in control of the Western world. These are the ones who have gone to war against Western nations by imposing immigration on Western nations, by imposing multiculturalism on Western nations. And this unsubstantiated allegation that Russia threatens the Western world is, as Alex said, and as I said at the start of this discussion, is a distraction. They are trying to distract Western nations, the attention of Western nations away from the carnage which has been brought about by the Western ruling elites in the Western world. It is also a way of the Western ruling elites giving themselves more power on the basis of, we want to protect you, but in order to do so, we have to have more power in order to protect you. So these are extremely dangerous days in the Western world. I am not at all worried about a World War III. No, I am worried by what is happening inside of the Western world. But at the same time, I am optimistic, because in the case of Britain, the vast majority of Britons have now woken up. There is a Christian revival in Britain. There is a cultural revival in Britain. People are speaking their minds without fear, without feeling intimidated. And that, of course, is a big threat to the British ruling elite and the Western ruling elites as a whole.
Can I ask you, Alex, as we are going to wind up fairly soon, if there is no war, what would the landscape look like, say for Europe and the UK? What will be their words of choice, the propaganda that would follow? What would the landscape look as they wind back their threats of beating each other's chest? Or if there is a war, what would the landscape look like?
Difficult questions. I mean, if there isn't, they will claim victory anyway, of course. So they will claim that they've contained Russia, and it was a threat that just about to roll into Europe, which they've heroically just saved us from. So they'll invent some propaganda that, whatever the outcome, however bad it is for Europe, they will obviously claim as a success in one way or another. I mean, if there is a war, of course, they'll just, as Pelle suggested, they'll just demonize Russia. And we've already seen that already. I think you're starting to see these drone stories. For example, one day a Russian drone is attacking Zelensky's plane in Ireland. And then 2 days later, the story comes out, well, actually, those drones were no threat at all. Who knows, what the final real story of that is. Maybe they had nothing to do with Russia even in the first place. So they just keep inventing these propaganda stories to demonize Russia. Then, they're either fake or they're sort of completely twisted out of all recognition. So I guess that's what they'll do. They'll claim a victory. If there isn't a war, they'll claim that they've contained this deadly threat. And if there is, they'll just have to demonize Putin and Russia every day, 24/7. And I get the final landscape. I don't know. I think the final landscape, as your other speaker suggested, is going to be quite totalitarian. And as you hinted out, they're going to use this as an excuse to clamp down on free speech even more. In the national interest, there'll be all kinds of restrictions, internet censorship, and whoever knows what else. So I think they'll take another giant leap towards a sort of more totalitarian regime as they did during COVID.
Well, Jacques Bode was banned from traveling in the EU. I mean, he's one of the more moderate commentators. I mean, he's a guy that 1 degree of separation away from us guys, I mean, he's been on similar kinds of shows. He's a Swiss military analyst, very well credentialed, written beautiful books about analyzing the war. And he's a Swiss citizen. And he uses only Western sources. He makes a point of using only Western sources, not Russian sources, because he says the information's out there. And he's been on the Glenn Deason show and everything. I mean, he's a really regular guy if you watch these YouTube geopolitics shows. And he can't travel now. I mean, he's been removed from the possibility of making an income because he doesn't hew with the narrative. So George Galloway is living in exile now, Britain's most popular podcaster, because he gets stopped every time he goes through British customs. So, this could be just the beginning of crackdowns.
What sort of words will they use, though, when the war doesn't happen, after encouraging everyone to think we're going to go to war? Will they say that they won it, that Putin backed down and we were just far too strong? I've got no idea. And I'd like to know your thoughts, Pelle.
I mean, there's an argument, even from devout anti-militarists such as myself, that if America does pull out of Europe, Britain and Europe do need to man up. And I haven't resolved that question in my own mind, how much Europe has lived off American defense spending, Russian cheap gas and Chinese cheap goods for years. And this couldn't last in a way, because at some point these countries would be against each other and Britain's and Europe's balancing act would completely fall apart, which it has. And so there's a lot of talk of strategic autonomy. So you could be, to be a little bit charitable to the Europe's elites. Maybe there does seem to be some kind of rearmament, some kind of reasonable defense spending. I haven't sorted the question out, but there is a question that Europe does have to develop an autonomous capability if they are to be independent, and the Americans do.
We've even in Australia. Sorry,
I just go with John Mearsheim and said, talk to the Russians, get their cheap gas back, and be nice to them. Don't listen to the Balts.
I think in Australia we're even talking about sending our troops over.
It's crazy. So you've learned nothing since Gallipoli.
But the thing is, we did send some bushmasters to Ukraine to help out, and they were very much akin to a Morris Minor, and just as reliable. So anyway, but we got rid of them. Marcus, your thoughts on what we've just been talking about? How do you see the landscape? Either if they wind it back, and do they say that they won this war because they had whatever, or if we go to war, how does the landscape look?
Well, the reason why Australia is discussing whether it should send its soldiers to Ukraine is because Australia is part of the House of Windsor's kingdom, as is Canada, as is New Zealand. So again, Australian prime ministers are not fully in control. What is in control is the British ruling elite. And in regard to how the Western ruling elites would respond if there is no war between Russia and the West, well, they will say that democracy defeated tyranny, freedom defeated tyranny. The coalition of the willing maintained its composure, maintained its resolve, and it defeated the evil empire of Putin. Mike, all that preposterous nonsense, all that regurgitated bile, which means absolutely nothing in practice. Again, my concern, as the concern should be of every other person living in the Western world, is what is happening in the Western world on account of the policies and the dark, malignant, ideological agenda of the Western ruling elites. We see, for example, in Britain, how dangerous it is to leave your house, how dangerous it is to board buses and trains and whatnot. There is the danger. We have a British state which loathes the British people, which loathes the heritage of the British people. There is the danger.
Yeah, I do agree. And speaking of going to war, just for those that follow the Ashes, Australia are 8 for 328, so we're winning that war against England too, so that's always a good sign. Not good for you guys. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, if somebody wanted to see more on what you do, your videos and your podcast and so forth, how do they do that?
Thank you, Mike. I am on X, Facebook, YouTube, Rumble and Odyssey, and my 2 books pertaining to Russian/Soviet history and modern day Russian politics can be purchased on Amazon.
And Pelle Taylor, journalist and filmmaker, and has an excellent new podcast with Martin Seif. How does somebody find out more about you, Pelle, and how do they watch what you're doing at the moment?
Apparently you have to use the name Pelle Taylor, not the Pelle Neroth Taylor bit I just discovered. So Pelle Taylor, you'll find my books. They're all on Amazon. I've written about the Cold War,
I don't know whether
about flags,
whatever.
World War One, and I've also got the pntshow.substack.com, which is gaining. I did a script with you guys, and that's gaining a lot of views because I wrote an article about it afterwards. And you can see my films just on Amazon. I've done a number of films, and also this podcast with Martin Seif called the Geopolitics, called The Capitals Uncovered, and we had an Australian lady on just yesterday who talked about she was. Won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1985, and she was a doctor warning about the dangers of nuclear war, and she was lamenting the fact that, but it's not. Nuclear war can happen. Global warming, as Trump said, that could happen in 5 seconds, not the global warming that's going to happen over 50 years,
And Alex Kriel, founder of Thinking Coalition, same question. If somebody wants to enjoy your work and or find out more on what you do, how do they do that?
Yeah, it's on X. It's at Think Coalition. It's one word. And on Substack, it's thinkingcoalition.substack.com. But we're having some trouble with Substack, so that's for the moment. So let's see what happens.
Have you passed the verification? Are you as old as you look? I mean that'd be not trying to be rude there.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, they put our content as adult content, which is completely outrageous. It's something we're talking to them about why they've done that. So,
yeah, free speech is really rocketing along. Not, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I have enjoyed this as always. Thank you so much. This has been The Protagonists, and this is The World Today.